Read on that sort of stuff, the Carlyle Group co-founder and author of the American Story, Conversations with Master Historians. Of course, I'm talking about David Rubenstein. Sometimes it's caught on mic, other times it's just sort of whispered and snickered. What do you think?
I think the most important thing is to make sure you know when your mic is on and when your mic is off. So right. I try very hard to do that because I have been caught myself saying sometimes things I wish I hadn't said.
I can't picture mean or nasty things.
If summits went along as smoothly as they are supposed to go, it wouldn't be fun to cover, right? So every time I've ever seen a summit, there's always something that happens that people didn't anticipate. So this summit probably had some of those things as well. But in the end, I think they have made pretty good progress on NATO-related issues. The most important thing there is this. There was concern whether President Trump cares about NATO or not, and I think he made it pretty clear that he thinks NATO is important, as I think most people who've been involved with NATO do. So I think that's a good thing.
Do you know other foreign leaders on the spot that they don't flip over him, and they make it very, very clear?
He clearly has a different approach and personality than the people who typically have that job. So it's different, and people are getting used to it. And I think that clearly the press and others are trying to adjust to it. He has a strong personality. I know him somewhat, and I would say he's just different than other people I've known who've been president of the United States. That's not either good or bad. It's just a different personality, and people have to adjust to that. I
wonder if there's some calculation, though, going on here, David, in that he's really reaching an American audience. If he's putting them on the defensive about, for example, defense spending to keep up to their NATO commitment, that is something that a lot of American citizens, voters, hear and say, yeah, he's right about that. They should pay up.
President Trump is, I think, singularly focused on his base and in his appeal in the United States. I think he's less concerned about what people think about him outside of the United States than what they think about him inside the United States. You can say that's good or bad, but I think that's his focus, maybe more so than other presidents. I don't criticize it. I just say that he's very focused on what his supporters like and what Americans want. And I think Americans probably do want to have others honor their NATO 2% commitment.
He has joked, maybe half-kiddingly, about how Republicans aren't treated as well by Europeans as traditionally Democrats are. John Kennedy was feted as a star. Barack Obama, the same thing. FDR was held in great regards. Maybe had a little bit of Ronald Reagan that got some of that, but it took some years. But that it's harder for Republicans to get the same type of reaction.
Well, there's no doubt that many people in Europe have policies that are probably further to the left than the policies that some Republicans have, and therefore I think the press and the government officials there probably are not in sympathy with some of the things that some Republicans have as their positions, and that may be reflected in some of the way they handle things and maybe reflected in the press. But generally, I think that everybody in Europe really wants NATO to be strong. I think the president wants NATO to be strong, and I think that's a good thing. And while the summit will be remembered for an open mic or so, in the end, I think when history is written, people will say, yes, President Trump does support NATO, and NATO is strong.
Do you think that because he talks about the $160 billion in increased funding for NATO under his 3 years, that's the message he wanted to pound? Thanks to me getting in your face about paying up, NATO's a lot stronger now.
Financially, NATO may be stronger. The issue, of course,
people covering the case, covering Lyndon Johnson for better than 4 decades. You learn about how historians appreciate presidents who appreciate history. And I'm wondering how this president fits into that.
Well, many presidents have been interested in history, and they've read history books, and they've had historians come in. I don't know if President Trump has done that as much, but other presidents have done so. I think learning what your predecessors did is very important. I think President Trump absorbs information not by reading books so much, but by talking to people. And I think he has talked to other people who are historians about what has happened in previous presidencies, and I think he's benefited from that. There's no doubt when you become president of the United States, you're starting on day one, and you don't have the history of the presidency the way you will after 1 or 2 or 3 years. And the president now is much better, much more knowledgeable about what previous presidents have had to struggle with.
Do you look at the backdrop of these impeachment hearings starting in the Judiciary Committee today? That's a pretty alarming backdrop to what's going on right now.
It is of concern, of course, to everybody that you have an impeachment process, because whether you think it's appropriate or not, nobody really wants to go through impeachment because it disrupts the government. And maybe it's appropriate, maybe not, but we've only had this 4 times in our country's history. Andrew Johnson, then Richard Nixon, though he ultimately resigned before the process went forward, Bill Clinton, and now we're having one as well, perhaps. So I think it's not a great thing for the country to do. Members of Congress can decide whether it's appropriate or not, but nobody wants to have a system like this where you perpetually are having these kind of impeachment processes. So when this one is resolved one way or the other.
The president cynically thinks Democrats do. Some Democrats do.
I don't know that anybody really wants to go through an impeachment process. I think what people really want to do is have the government work as well as possible. Now, this may be more political than it should be. In fact, all impeachment processes are political. Andrew Johnson's was political. I think all of them have some politics to it. It's rarely the case in all of the impeachment processes where people of the opposite party or the same party as the president actually get involved and support an impeachment. It has happened, but generally, people of the opposition party are the ones who tend to support the impeachment process.
Let me flip around, talk about your Carlyle expertise, your financial expertise. Of course, it's made you a multi-billionaire. But this notion that the markets, and the president constantly pounds them, are inexplicably linked to presidential performance. That when they were down, they didn't benefit Jimmy Carter. They didn't benefit Herbert Hoover. When they were up, they certainly benefited. It's a nice win to have at your back.
One of the things that I think all presidents recognize is that presidents who are running for re-election in recessions do not tend to get re-elected.
Right.
The last one who got re-elected was William McKinley in 1900. But when George Herbert Walker Bush ran, Jimmy Carter ran, and also when Gerald Ford ran during a recession, they didn't get reelected. So if you're a president and you know enough about history to know that that's the pattern, you want to make certain that you don't have a recession. I think.
Does he overdo it? Does he risk overdoing it?
Well, I think the president wants, as all presidents do, to have a very good economy. And I think he's obsessed with making certain the economy stays strong, and he doesn't want to have a recession in the year that he's running for re-election. So I think all presidents. Turned out it really wasn't a recession.
Yeah, it was just turning around.
Right.
But
so
a little too late for people to notice.
He didn't really get the benefit of it, unfortunately, from his point of view. But I think President Trump, I can't speak for him, but my impression would be that he recognizes if he's in a recession, it's not going to be great for a re-election. But if he's not in a recession, I think his chances of getting re-elected are reasonably good.
Do you think a China trade deal would sort of ice the deal here? Because the president seemed to throw cold water on that by saying that, we might not get a deal till after the election. Because that would rattle markets. Did yesterday, a little less so today.
My view is that there will be a deal. I don't have any inside information. I can't speak for the administration. But I do think they're very, very close, and I do think there will be an announcement in the not-too-distant future. There's always one last thing that has to be resolved or so. I was in China recently. I did have a meeting with many other people as well, with Xi Jinping, and I think I had a sense out of that there's something that's going to get done. It won't solve all of our problems. It'll be a phase 1, and when phase 2 will come, we don't know. But I'd be very surprised if the president would want to go into a re-election with this overhanging him.
I find it, I'm a little offended that Xi Jinping met with you. He did not meet with me, but it could have been just a scheduling.
Well, I think he wanted to meet with you, but he told me they just couldn't get he didn't have your cell phone number.
Yeah, I got it.
Next time I will
in all seriousness, how did it go? I mean, what was his temperament? What could you read? The Chinese delegation, whatever you want to call it, what's their read of this?
There was a number of people in the meeting, Hank Paulson and
former Treasury Secretary.
Right, and Henry Kissinger and a number of other people from the United States and elsewhere. There was probably 30 people in a meeting. And he took questions, and then he wrote down the questions, and he answered them in seriatim. And I think he's obviously there a trade agreement with the United States. He made it clear he doesn't want to be pushed around, but I think he made it clear that he thinks that a good trade agreement now would be a good thing for both countries.
Were you getting
No president wants to say, I have to have an agreement. And I think President Trump's statement, again, I can't speak for him, but I don't think he'd want to say, I better get this agreement soon because otherwise I'm in political trouble. He wouldn't say that. And I think he made it clear, look, I don't have an agreement now. That's okay. I can survive without one. I think he's sending a message to China, look, I don't have to have one, so don't feel I'm desperate. But I think they're very close, and I think it will get done in the not-too-distant future.
Can you hang with me through this next break?